Day 1056 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 811,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,330 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 3 tanks, 11 APVs, 47 artillery, and 1 multiple launch rocket system. And now to the map, which at some point we should start calling the Russian War Map, as Ukraine's military-industrial complex is hitting its stride, reportedly now producing 82 one-way drones and 8 cruise missiles daily. And the impact? A relentless wave of UAVs now that strike deep into Russian territory, targeting military assets with increasingly alarming precision. As overnight, Ukraine's defense forces carried out one of the largest attacks on Russian military facilities, targeting locations from 200 kilometers to about 1,100 kilometers deep inside Russia. And first looking at Bryansk, because in a significant strike, Ukraine's military targeted production facilities, reportedly through the use of ATACMS missiles loaded with cluster munitions. Explosions rocked a chemical plant and nearby military microelectronics facility at Seltso, some 115 kilometers or about 70 miles from Ukraine's border, with Russian media reporting about 30 blasts in this incident. Now, the chemical plant, crucial for producing propellants and ammunition, took a heavy hit. Russian air defenses scrambled but were unable to intercept the missiles. Meanwhile, Bryansk governor Bogomaz made a statement on the matter, saying of the incident, quote, "Ukraine attempted a combined missile strike on the Bryansk region, but all targets were intercepted by air defense." Yes, successfully intercepted by the chemical factory. And on the topic of proximity, who builds a strategic war factory next to the country you plan to invade? I mean, with long-term desires to directly expand south and west, that particular placement was evidently quite the oversight for Russia. Then on the map, and back to Engels, where reports of the fuel depot being attacked for a second time just mere hours after the previous blaze was extinguished after 5 days. Specifically, the target here was the struck Crystal oil depot. Of course, as mentioned, part of the Engels 2 military airfield infrastructure. Reports also of the Saratov oil refinery being hit as well. This location cannot catch a break. Then added to some more Russian pain points on the map, because in the Tula Oblast, which was hit by a massive drone attack of its own overnight, with residents at the location reported at least 10 explosions, with this particular strike targeting the Aleskin chemical plant, which is barely 150 kilometers from Moscow. But as for these overnight engagements, the overnight distance record goes to Kazan of Tatarstan, some 1,100 kilometers away, with a liquefied gas depot struck by Ukrainian drones at the Ogsintez chemical plant. And so overall, the Ukrainian drones fly increasingly unchallenged over untidy abodes, en route to military production facilities, delivering their payloads with precision and efficiency. And so as of now, every building, military complex, factory, airfield, at least 1,000 kilometers from Ukraine is within range of the AFU, leaving Russia to grapple with a new reality of what's stepped up to be a missile and drone near-peer conflict they never anticipated. Now also, other regions of Russia were reported to have drone incursions overnight, including Oryol, Voronezh, Rostov, and at least one other location somewhere here on the map, but the above mentioned were clearly the outstanding examples overnight. And because of all that, now Russian telegrammers are struggling to comprehend why, so late into this war, why their so-called superpower consistently fails to stop massive waves of Ukrainian drones and missiles, incapable of countering them effectively. They are now searching for someone to blame. Then, with a lot of activity in Russia today, let's at least briefly look across to Ukraine, with perhaps the biggest news in the Donbass in Donetsk, to the east of Pokrovsk, as Russian forces have likely severed a key highway near the town as they look to tighten their grip in the region. This strategic move aims to disrupt Ukrainian supply lines, pressuring Kyiv troops to retreat. It also appears that Russians experience the Seladova problem with Pokrovsk. That is to say, they understand that they won't be able to take it by assaulting it head-on, so they're trying to go around it, making for a much more difficult process. Then to the southwest in Zaporizhia, we saw the AFU mine roads with drones and then control them with FPVs, which creates a significant problem with the logistics of the occupiers in this region. Also noting the stockpiling set up for each distribution or redeployment by drones. Then to a questionable move of Russia's south on the map to Crimea, as Atesh partisans report a shift in Russia's military stance in Crimea due to Moscow bolstering its air defenses, pulling S-400s and radar from other fronts. Now, evidently, Russia cannot protect everywhere, so this reactive move reflects potential vulnerabilities, revealing a military scrambling to protect crucial assets in a renewed and a clear sign that Russia is feeling the pressure, feeling forced to prioritize Crimea, a region they can't afford to lose, and most importantly, cannot allow the embarrassing loss from a successful strike on the Kerch Bridge. It would be some terribly bad PR for Russia if that Kerch Bridge went down. All the meanwhile, such wasteful resource utilization to keep it up. Then, taking a look around the map, because somewhere in the east, seen here is the construction of new Ukrainian fortified entrenchments with reinforced concrete bunkers focused on providing overhead concealment and protection from FPVs. But then I must take you across to some of the real comedy acts, as starting out with another Russian hardware news update, because seen here is the Russian logistical behemoth, complete with motorbikes and improvised carts. No rubber on these tires and no all-terrain capability either. Somehow it's like watching kids with toy cart sets. Then also another look at Russian hardware. Here we have a golf buggy spotted and recorded by another Russian soldier in a white civilian van. How long will either of these last? And as for the 8 toilet plungers on top, well, they're likely part of an electronic warfare countermeasure to keep them safe from incoming Ukrainian FPV drones. In fact, Russians have been known to stack on as many electronic warfare components as they can onto a single vehicle, usually a tank. Back in the good old days. Even still, it by no means guarantees successful jamming of radio waves. And with the advent of AI drones not far away, a potentially severed wireless communication link from these toilet plungers, assuming they even work, won't actually make a difference by that point with those AI drones, because they'll simply switch to autopilot in their terminal phase as they descend upon the vehicle. Then headed across to some more news. So in a bold address to the European Parliament, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called for a seismic shift in defence spending. He argued that the current 2% GDP commitment is woefully inadequate, suggesting EU nations may need to allocate beyond 3% to safeguard their sovereignty. His remark reflects a growing urgency within the alliance, so it appears the writing is on the wall. And if NATO wants to avoid feeling outmatched by a larger, less economically robust Russia, then a significant increase in defense spending is essential to maintain a credible deterrent and ensure collective security. Then, in some more news, and being the middle of January now, so on the topic of potential upcoming negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, Editor-in-Chief of Russia Today, Margarita Simonyan, in a recent interview, and in statements echoing Kremlin talking points, where she specifies the necessity of retaining control over occupied territories of Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson as part of any negotiations, where she reaffirmed such regions are now part of the constitution of the Russian Federation. And it's so easy to forget that sometimes, which absolutely boggles the mind for several reasons, because Russia just decided to go ahead and annex territories of occupied land in the middle of a war. But perhaps even more boggling than that is, what exactly constitutes annexed lands? Because, for example, Russia annexed the entirety of Zaporizhia and Donetsk without ever having stepped foot in it militarily at any point during this war. And bizarrely, even the never-occupied capital of Zaporizhia within the wider oblast, where the largest portion of the population resides, is apparently Russian too. It's just utter madness. And now, with this interview, there's also really no hiding of intentions from the Russian side, as Simonian states that Russia wants to, of course, take Odessa, Kyiv, and Kharkiv, but it's not in the cards for negotiation because they don't have it right now. And then on this very topic, Kremlin spokesperson Peskov, and toilet brush wannabe, said of it, quote, "Russia is ready for negotiations on its own terms, which Ukraine cannot accept. But these terms include refusing to join NATO and abandonment of territories." So there you have it, Russia demanding unacceptable concessions that undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but even worse, insisting on a Ukrainian exclusion from NATO, a stance that merely paves the way for Russia to regroup and make renewed attempts to complete its original aggressive ambitions. So right back to where Ukraine started, only worse. Then headed across to another Russian economy news update, and of a less publicised sector because in a troubling development for Russia's agricultural sector, banks are pulling out of preferential loans programs for farmers, citing high financial risks. This marks a significant blow following their IT industry's similar plight. Now, the Ministry of Agriculture plans to redistribute loan limits among other banks, but the uncertainty looms. Head of the Russian People's Farmer Association, Oleg Sirota, warns that farmers may struggle to secure funding before the sowing season. In fact, crop yields have largely declined in Russia since the full-scale SMO, including the lowering yields of potatoes, apples, carrots, beets, cabbage, berries, and so on. Now, remarkably, there has even been a decline in wheat, which appears paradoxical in light of Russia's access to the occupied Ukrainian lands, for Ukraine is often deemed the breadbasket of Europe. Now, for this crop, initially in 2022, at the start of the SMO, Russia had an increase in wheat yields, no surprises, gaining additional fertile wheat lands, but there's only been declining wheat yields since then of about 10% per annum. So I think it's fair to say that it seems local investment was the better solution as opposed to invading their neighbor. So the fallout is such that many farmers in Russia are reported to be selling their farms, facing bleak prospects with this financial squeeze that could severely impact Russia's food production, highlighting vulnerabilities in its economic landscape. Who could have thought that a sustained 21% interest rate was going to impact the economy? Then headed across to a quick funny to round it all off for today, guys. But it's more of an absurdity, this one, so I more and more notice that the Russian military bloggers sometimes come up with the most unbelievable nonsense. Like this very popular Russian telegrammer with the screen handle of Veterans Notes, proclaiming that Europe as a whole has no chance of survival, but also going as far as to state that the US is out to methodically destroy it. Now, Europe, as a whole, is considered one of the United States' greatest allies. The transatlantic relationship is built on shared democratic values, economic ties, and mutual security commitments. Meanwhile, this telegrammer, to make his point, inadvertently paints a negative portrait of the Russian economy, where he called the EU, China, and the States technology economies. Fair enough. But then goes on to contrast this with how Russia is, or rather, as he says, was, a resource-driven economy, practically referring to it as a one-trick pony that it is. Or was. But my favourite part here is how he states, quote, "The only thing that can save Europe is Russia," where I suppose he's referring to the same Russia whose GDP is about 10 times smaller than that of the EU. Ah yes, Russia, the self-proclaimed saviour of Europe, armed with a shrinking economy, a failure of a 3-day SMO, and dreams of becoming an empire. Russia is here to protect you, Europe. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe, and I do hope to see all of you guys, each and every one of you, there in the next one. Cheers!